taxes was taxing. Now taxes is relaxing when you file for free.
I can file for free? TurboTax Free Edition. Roughly 37% of filers qualify. Simple Form 1040 returns only. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free. I can file for free.
Now this is taxes. File for free with TurboTax Free Edition and get your maximum refund. No schedules except for Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, and Student Loan Interest. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free.
Nobody has more respect for women than I do. Nobody.
Hillary Clinton wants to abolish it, believe me. She wants to abolish our Second Amendment.
I think they didn't deny it. I don't think anybody denied it.
Other presidents did not call. They'd write letters, and some presidents didn't do anything.
Many people have come out and said I'm right.
You really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
Hello and welcome to a very special episode, a bonus episode of Fallacious Trump. This is the first bonus episode we've ever done, and patrons are not getting charged for this. It's completely free and just a little bit extra. And let me tell you the reason why this is happening. First of all, it's just me. It's just Jim today. Mark isn't here. And I'm doing this because I'm responding directly to a conversation that I've had with someone on Twitter. I'm fairly active on Twitter. If you don't already follow us, you can go to twitter.com/fallacioustrump and follow us there. And I try to engage with people. I talk about some of the stuff that Trump says and some of the arguments he makes, and I respond directly to Trump supporters often who are making fallacious arguments or claiming things which aren't true. And sometimes I get some pushback for that. A lot of the times people aren't very civil about it and they just kind of repeat the same talking points. And sometimes they are. Sometimes they're quite nice about it and actually want to engage. And recently I spoke to a guy on Twitter who goes by Bobby the Great. His Twitter handle is, I think, @_Bobby the Great. And he responded to something I had said about Trump, and we talked a little bit, and he asked me, he was very civil, and he asked me for some examples of things that I thought were fallacies that Trump said. And so I gave him a few examples. I could have pointed him directly to the podcast and said, go and listen to the podcast, or pointed him to my book, which would have given him maybe 50 examples of things that Trump had said. It's called Fallacious Trump, by the way, available on Amazon. But I wanted to engage with him in the format that we were in on Twitter. And so I gave him just a few examples off the top of my head, one of which was the straw man argument that has been coming up more and more recently, where Trump claims that Democrats' views on abortion have got so radical and so extreme that they now advocate the ability to execute babies after birth. Now, this is a ridiculous, insane view of what Democrats' views are. It's not true, but he keeps on saying it, and some people on the right keep saying this. He didn't respond directly with, oh yeah, that's what Democrats think. He did say, actually, you know, there's people on both sides who agree with abortion in late-term abortion, and this he thought was something that he'd heard from a New York bill, but he recognized that he didn't know a great deal about it, and he'd have to go and look at it, which is great. That people don't just kind of knee-jerk respond, but actually want to know more about it. He did come back to say, actually, yes, this is a New York bill. It did pass, and he sent me a link to a newspaper from Quincy, Illinois called the Herald Whig, which talked a bit about this. He said, it was on a bill in New York, it passed. Maybe you should drop the word Trump out of your podcast title. So part of the conversation we were having was that he feels, if my interpretation is correct, that other politicians make these same kinds of arguments and we shouldn't pick on Trump. It's not right. My argument on that is that, first of all, we don't hide our politics. We're definitely left-leaning, but we don't bash Trump for the sake of it. We try to educate people about logical fallacies, bad arguments, faulty reasoning. And one way to do that in an entertaining way is to use examples from Trump, because he does provide us, I think, honestly, with more examples than any other individual politician. And it's something which is relevant to everyone's lives at the moment. So it makes the topic interesting and informative. So, point is, the whole purpose of this quick episode is to respond directly to Bobby about this, because I could do it on Twitter, but actually explaining why an argument is wrong often takes a lot longer than just saying the thing that is wrong. So by doing it in this way, I can give a little bit more context, a little bit more detail, and hopefully not just do a little stream of 5 or 6 tweets that don't really give the full answer. So I'm going to send this link to Bobby. I hope he listens to it. And in the meantime, I hope that the listeners for the regular show can hear my thought process and find it interesting. So the link that Bobby the Great sent me was a newspaper in Quincy, Illinois called the Herald Whig. And I don't know much about this newspaper. I couldn't find out a great deal about it, but it isn't an article. It is, in fact, a letter from a reader to the newspaper, which they printed, which is fine. And we talked in our very first episode about genetic fallacy, about the importance of sources. So I would never say that just because this is a letter to the newspaper, that means it's wrong. That would be fallacious. However, it is important, as we acknowledged in that first episode, to consider how important or how likely those sources are to be well researched or correct or to have some weight behind them. And so we don't know anything about the person who wrote this letter, so we can't really decide based on that whether his arguments are likely to be right or not. I'm not going to read the whole letter, but the first part of it does lay out his response to a particular law that's just been passed in New York, which addresses the exact thing that we were talking about. Trump's claim that Democrats now advocate the ability to execute babies after birth. So the first paragraph of this letter says, "The state of New York recently passed a horrific new abortion law, removing almost all previous restrictions. The law now allows abortions to be performed up to the point of natural birth by physicians and also by some non-physician healthcare practitioners. It also removes protections for babies who accidentally survive an abortion procedure. Those living, breathing babies can now legally be killed by one means or another after being born." So that's that particular reader's interpretation of information that he has heard, presumably, about this law from New York. And it is presumably media coverage that he's read about it. I don't know. And that is the kind of media coverage, at least, that makes those points, that seems to be leading to people on the right making this claim and Trump making this claim that Democrats now think it is okay for babies to be executed after birth. That isn't the case. It simply isn't the case. And in arguing against this, I could make reference to news sources from the left, which obviously would be more likely to promulgate the kind of pro-choice arguments and look at it in that sense. But that's not particularly helpful either. So one thing you can do is try and look for the most unbiased sources, and a place that you can go to find out how biased sources seem to be on either side is a place called MediaBiasFactCheck.com. And you can put in any media source. The bigger ones are more likely to be on there. The Herald Whig from Quincy, Illinois isn't in fact on there, but it will tell you how questionable that source is, how extreme on either side of the spectrum it is. And so I looked at 3 sources for fact checking specifically, which are all seen by Media Bias Fact Check as least bias. They're very central in their views, and they try to be balanced in calling out things on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of the political spectrum. Those are Politifact.com, factcheck.org, and Snopes.com. Now, each of those sometimes get called liberal by people on the right-hand side of the spectrum. So I would suggest if you are of that view, go to MediaBiasFactCheck.com, put in some of the sites that you consider to be one side or the other, and see what they have to say about them. Because MediaBiasFactCheck.com seems really to call out major sources on either side of the spectrum and say they can be questionable, they can be likely to use loaded language, or they do give reasons for saying how they feel about these particular sources. And if you read the articles about this particular New York bill, which is S-240 in the New York Senate, the Reproductive Health Act, they do address some of these points. They talk about the changes that have been made to late-term abortions and things like that. And they address the idea of whether the bill actually allows the execution, as Trump puts it, of babies after they've been born. So you can look at those, and those are very useful, and they do give a bit more information. They give some context. They give quotes from people on both sides of the argument. They fact check those quotes as well. But more important to do than that is to go as far as you can to the original source. It's useful to have that context of unbiased reporting to see where something falls into place. And from that, you can learn, for example, that the fundamental thing that this bill does, S240, is bring New York's state abortion laws into line with Roe v. Wade. Because there's some feeling among particularly pro-choice circles that the increasing conservatism of the Supreme Court makes it possible, at least, possibly likely, that Roe v. Wade is going to be either overturned or dramatically reduced in effectiveness by the Supreme Court if that gets challenged. And there are states where that won't make any difference because their state laws already cover a lot of the same protections for abortion that Roe v. Wade allows federally. But there are some states where if Roe v. Wade was repealed, the abortion in that state would immediately become illegal. New York isn't one of those states. It's reasonably robust since 1970. They've had abortion laws there which allow for abortions up to 24 weeks and past that, where it is likely to result in death for the mother if they continue. But what it doesn't do is some of the things that are allowed in Roe v. Wade, including considering the mother's health after 24 weeks. So essentially, the main things that this bill does are to bring New York state law in line with federal law. And another thing that it does is it decriminalizes abortions from abortion providers. It stops it being a felony to provide an abortion just slightly outside those limits and turns it into a public health law issue. So it doesn't make it legal. It just stops it being a part of the criminal code. Now, if you look at the text of the state law, and I should say I'm going to put this up on the website. I will make I'll do some quick show notes that are just going to be very basic, but they will be links to these sites, the original letter, the fact-checking sites, and indeed the text of the bill itself. So if you go to fallacioustrump.com/FT22A, because this isn't a regular episode, it's just in between episodes, I'll put in those links and you can see this directly for yourself. But if you go to the actual text of the bill itself, you can see it lays out the things that they've added and the things that they've taken away. And there's kind of red text with lines through it saying basically removing abortion from the homicide part of the criminal code and adding the idea that New York has that every individual has the fundamental right to choose or refuse contraception or sterilization, and a fundamental right to choose to carry a pregnancy to term or to have an abortion pursuant to this article, and so on. And one thing in there, which is the part which seems to be most relevant to this argument that Trump has that you can execute babies after birth, according to the Democrats, is line 53 on page 2, which says section 4164 of the public health law is repealed. So by the passing of this act, that is a part of the public health law that is taken away. Now, if you go and look up section 4164, again, I'll link to that in the show notes. It is talking about how abortions after the 12th week of pregnancy can only be performed in a hospital on an inpatient basis. So that means that basically, according to that law, you can't have an abortion in a clinic after 12 weeks. It has to be in a hospital. So it removes that requirement. It says that when an abortion is to be performed after the 20th week, a physician other than the physician performing the abortion shall be in attendance to take control of and to provide immediate medical care for any live birth that is the result of an abortion. So basically that's saying that you have to have a second doctor there ready to look after the fetus should it survive. So does this mean that in that very unlikely case where a fetus survives the abortion, that they can be killed? No, it doesn't. Not requiring an extra doctor to be there doesn't mean that you can kill the baby. Paragraph 2 of Public Health Law Section 4164 says such child, i.e. one that is born alive, shall be accorded immediate legal protection under the laws of the state of New York. Now, that is the part which people on the right point to and say, see, you're saying that there is no legal protection for those babies that are born alive. And if that was the only thing that was part of the law, then you would have an argument. But if you go back to S240, the actual bill that has been passed, the Reproductive Health Act, in the homicide section, page 3, line 19, it defines a person in relation to homicide and related offences as a human being who has been born and is alive. So the point is, although that section 4164 of the Public Health Law has been repealed, and that section provided legal protection under the laws of the state of New York to children who are born alive, it's not the only thing that provided those children with protection. Repealing that hasn't taken away protection. It simply means that those children are protected from being killed by a different law. Those children are protected under the homicide laws of the US because they are human beings who have been born and are alive. They're not unprotected. They're simply unprotected by that particular section of the public health law. They are no longer protected by that as well. It doesn't mean they can then be executed. It doesn't mean Democrats want them to be able to be executed. They have removed that section because it had other restrictions in it that they didn't want, and it's not necessary. The restrictions it removed are stopping people from having abortions in clinics as opposed to hospitals after 12 weeks, and stopping needing to have a second doctor there after 20 weeks. The protection for children who are in the unlikely event of being born alive is not necessary to have in there because it's already covered by other parts of the law. So it's really important to look at the original source as much as you can. And this does take time, and that's why I've decided to do this in this format rather than just to explain it in a couple of tweets. It does take time to understand this. It does take time to research it and look at it. And yeah, people can't be expected to constantly check everything that is said. But the president should know this. And it's very likely the president does know this. It is very, very likely the president knows that the change in the law in New York does not allow babies to be executed after birth. If he doesn't know it, he should do. But the reality is likely he is saying it despite knowing it's not true. He's saying it knowing that it is an argument which is easy to win. It's an argument, that's what a straw man is. It's changing the actual argument into one that's easier to win. And the actual argument is that New York was celebrating because they have changed the law to make sure that the rights of New York citizens are protected, just as they currently are by federal law. Should the federal law be taken away, their rights will not go away with it. What they haven't done is what Trump is claiming. And no one is advocating for that. There are no Democrats who are saying we should be allowed to execute babies after birth. Nobody's saying that. That's ridiculous. But by saying it, by saying this is what Democrats think, and by pointing to things that if you don't look very hard, they seem to support that, they're making a fallacious argument. They're making a straw man argument, which is easy for people to say, well, that's terrible, that shouldn't be allowed, and to demonize Democrats for doing that. And that's what the letter writer who wrote to the Herald Whig did. They believe, if their letter is to be taken at face value, that the state of New York has passed a law saying you can kill babies who survive an abortion. And it says, can the degradation of this country get any worse under Democrats? Of course it can, and it probably will, if good people continue to stand by and do nothing to end this modern-day Holocaust. That is the letter writer's view of the Democrat Party, and the reason for that is because of arguments like this. Because of arguments that say Democrats think you should be allowed to kill babies. So, I'm going to end there. I hope that our regular listeners have found that useful. I hope that I've explained that in a way that helps to clarify why that view is not true, and why what the president is saying is a logical fallacy. and I hope that's been useful and interesting to you. We'll be back with our regularly scheduled programming next week, so by all means join us again if this is the first time you've listened to us, and if you're a regular listener, then we'll see you next time. I think the next fallacy we're going to do is poisoning the well, so that should be interesting. See you next time.
That's right. Go home to mommy. Bye. Bye.
Hi, I'm Devin Whitmire. People from South Carolina, like myself, are proud of their state, but even we don't know every nook and cranny or every piece of culture or history. To explore places that are off the beaten path, you have to talk to the people there, because their stories, their ideas, make everything come together. From Discover South Carolina, it's the Palmetto Porch. To learn more, visit scpalmettoporch.com.